Kamal, Trump has spoken once again. He spent a lot of time on the telephone. Should we listen to what he said about his conversations?
We had a great call, and it lasted for a long time, over an hour this morning. I also had with President Zelenskyy a very good call after that. And I think we're on the way to getting peace. I think President Putin wants peace, and President Zelenskyy wants peace, and I want peace. I just want to see people stop getting killed.
Before he became president, he said he would solve the war in Ukraine in 24 hours. Now, of course, it's been a little bit longer than that, but certainly this is one of the most pivotal moments in that conflict. Russia invaded, first of all, Crimea in 2014, and then more Ukrainian territory in 2022. We're almost at the third anniversary of that second stage of Russia's invasion into Ukraine. We shouldn't forget, Camilla, that initially Putin believed that he would be able, via shock and awe, to get all the way to Kyiv and take over the whole country. And because of American military backing and some European military backing and the strength and fortitude of Ukrainian forces, he actually has been halted from that ambition. But nevertheless, he has gained new territory in Ukraine beyond Crimea. It now looks like Donald Trump wants to pause it at that line, allowing Putin to retain the territory he has gained through an invasion of a sovereign state. And that is the reason why Ben Wallace, in an article for The Telegraph, former Defense Secretary and someone with real authority in this area, given his own military background, has said this has the whiff of Nazi appeasement in the 1930s, when, despite Germany's aggression then, we, the UK and others, attempted to do a deal with him in 1938.
So how is this actually going to play out? Well, Trump later put on Truth Social that a meeting with Zelenskyy was being set up for Friday at the Munich Security Conference to be led by the Vice President J.D. Vance and the Secretary of State Marco Rubio. Trump also said that he and Putin expect to meet in person, possibly in Saudi Arabia. So far, mixed interpretations of what all this means. President Zelenskyy himself has said, together with the US, we are charting our next steps to stop Russian aggression and ensure a lasting, reliable peace. As President Trump himself has said, let's get it done. So a degree of positivity from Zelenskyy, but the international community, and you mentioned our own former defense secretary there, very, very worried that this amounts to a capitulation by Trump to Putin.
And also today we've had the US Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth, who said it was unrealistic for Ukraine to return to its pre-2014 borders. So that would suggest that Putin is going to come out as a winner. And for the moment, it appears, Camilla, that Europe has been completely cut out of any of these discussions and negotiations. We've had David Lammy in the last few minutes coming out and demanding that the UK and Europe has a seat at the negotiating table. But what seems to have happened is Trump believes that the peace deal is going to be done not between Ukraine, Europe and Russia, but between America and Russia, and Europe will simply have to pick up the pieces of whatever those two nations decide.
And let's be honest, when we look at the history of J.D. Vance and Marco Rubio, and indeed Pete Hegseth's statements on this, these are all people that don't think America should be involved at all, really, in the conflict in Ukraine. So it may be a rather one-sided meeting when it comes to representing Western interests in all this. The other person that's been cut out completely, of course, is our own Defense Secretary John Healey, despite making it priority as soon as he came into office to visit Ukraine and to meet face-to-face with President Zelenskyy. I mean, Ben Wallace has come forward now. We've heard other very punchy statements from defence secretaries of yesteryear, including as well Grant Shapps. One wonders what Boris Johnson might have to say about all this, but it does look as if we have been completely shut out.
Particularly embarrassing for the Defence Secretary, given he's actually at NATO today with Peter Hegseth as all of this is happening beyond his control.
James Heappey joins us on the Daily Tea now, former Tory MP for Wells in Somerset, former Minister of State for the Armed Forces, a former Major in the Royal Gloucestershire, Berkshire and Wiltshire Regiment, the Rifles, served in Afghanistan and Iraq back in the day. James, lovely to have you on the show. What's your reaction to what Trump has announced?
Well, look, I mean, on the one hand, obviously, I am deeply concerned about what this means for the future of Euro-Atlantic security. Yesterday, make no mistake, is a pivotal day in this century. It marks a significant change in a US foreign policy that has endured since the end of the Second World War. But on the other hand, it is exactly what Trump said he would do. He has been clear throughout the 2 years of his candidature that he thinks the Europeans should be spending more on defense. In fact, he said that consistently all the way through his first presidency as well. He has said that he will end the war in Ukraine quickly. And whilst I personally find it absolutely abhorrent that it looks like the Ukrainians will not be an equal partner in those negotiations, nobody should be surprised at the pace at which he's acting and the way in which he's doing it.
Don't you worry that if the deal is done, that Putin retains the land that Russia has invaded in Ukraine, that Putin has frankly won, and he has shown that aggression has worked?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it is deeply challenging for people like me who have spent lots of time in the last 3 years whilst a minister saying this is about everything it takes for as long as it takes until this ends on Zelensky's terms and Zelensky's terms only. And now we're looking at a piece that is not about everything it takes for as long as it takes. We're basically saying that the US has had enough of supporting the Ukrainian cause, and that actually the peace deal, when it comes, will be something that Putin and Trump divine rather than something that Zelensky has. And the territorial compromise, if you think of Putin's effort in Ukraine since 2014 as a ratchet, he's taken Ukraine, paused, taken the Donbass, paused. All logic says that he will take the pause that is offered to him by Trump and the advantage that is given to him by US disinvestment from Europe, and that he will come again and take more of Ukraine in 8 to 10 years' time.
A lot of military commentators are saying, James, actually, this is all on us. This is all on Europe. It's on the UK, it's on France, it's on Germany for not spending enough on defence and letting the US have supremacy when it comes to deciding to do deals with the world's despots.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think, as I said in the beginning of our chat, this was well signposted. Trump said all the way through his first presidency that Europe needs to spend more. He's been saying for the last 2 years of his candidature that Europe needs to spend more. He's also been saying that his intent is to end the war in Ukraine quickly, and that he doesn't consider it to be an American priority to sustain the Ukrainian war effort. So none of this can be claimed as a surprise. All of it was well signposted. And you're absolutely right, Camilla, that this is on Europe, because we could and should. We've got, in the UK, France, Germany, and Italy, we've got 4 of the G7 economies within Europe. The European Union is the single largest trading bloc on earth. We should have by now mobilized our industries to such a scale that if America decided not to continue to support the Ukrainians, Europe could have done on the basis that it is in the Europeans' interests to do so. But 3 years into this war, or at the end of next week, we will reach the 3rd anniversary of the war. European industry still hasn't mobilized to anything like the degree. European defense spending hasn't gone up to anything like that, which you would have expected given there's a war on the continent. And so I think it is entirely legitimate to say that whilst it's deeply regrettable that US foreign policy appears to have changed so profoundly, the Europeans should have seen this coming and should have acted sooner to be ready for it.
Given, James, your military and your ministerial background and expertise, do you think there is any way that Europe will come together and get their spending back? We were discussing, Camilla, weren't we, before we did this interview with you, James? Margaret Thatcher in the 1980s spent 4.5% of UK GDP on defence. Is there any chance that Europe will realise the risks now and spend a lot more on defence, as has been asked by Donald Trump?
Well, look, the part of me that prefers there to be peace on our continent really hopes that the Europeans will see that this really is the moment. There isn't going to be another big signal in peacetime that we now need to step up and secure our continent for ourselves, and that the deterrent that must face down Putin comes from our own investment and commitment to our continental defense and security. And if we invest now, we will deter Russian aggression over the next couple of decades. If we do not, if we wait for the cruise missiles to start landing in Vilnius or in eastern Poland, then it will be too late, and Europe will find itself in a war. And I genuinely think that Grant Shapps and others are not being alarmist when they've described the period we're living in as a pre-war era. It is amazing that we're living in that era and haven't responded by increasing our defense spending yet. The fact that the US have now told us that we will not be their priority must surely be the last and final warning that we need, because the next one is probably Russian missiles landing somewhere that we care about and being forced to spend the money.
And James, just in terms of those fighting in Ukraine, our sister podcast, Ukraine the Latest, often speaks to troops on the ground. You've been there. You've been in a war zone. We know that they don't want to stop fighting. What will the impact of all this be on them, do you think?
It'll be awful. I mean, this war. I mean, look, in a much more limited way, because there were so many fewer of us. But this will feel awfully like to them what the end of the Afghanistan campaign and the withdrawal from Kabul felt like for veterans of the Afghanistan conflict. You know, you have just fought for years. And in the Ukrainian cases, in the bleakest of conditions, in those trenches in the Donbass, and all of a sudden you realize that two superpowers are going to sit down in Washington and Moscow and make the decision for you, and all of the blood that you've seen shed all around you, and all the blood, your own blood, that you fear may be shed whilst these negotiations go on, are ultimately sort of irrelevant, because there is no Ukrainian agency, apparently, in the way that Trump is looking to proceed. Now, my hope is, you know, the UK government and others have made clear overnight that they think that Ukraine must be integral to the peace process. I don't know whether or not Number 10 and the Foreign Office knew what was coming yesterday from Trump and Hegseth or not, but I hope that we do have sufficient voice in Washington in order to at least influence that Zelensky gets an equal say in this process. Otherwise, everything that we've stood for over the last 3 years, this being about, you know, Putin being seen to fail in Ukraine, it ending on Zelensky's terms, will have come to naught.
James Heappey, thank you very much indeed for joining us on the Daily Tea.
Thanks for having me.
Well, a really sober assessment there from James Heappey, and given his, as I said, military but also ministerial background, someone that we really need to listen to. As I was listening to him, I was just looking up the last time that Europe, well, certainly the UK, really tried to prosecute its own foreign policy in the teeth of American either opposition or disengagement. It was Suez, 1956.
Wow.
When we attempted to send an armed force alongside France to retake the canal. And America did not agree with that maneuver. And ever since the Second World War, as he says, this is a moment in history, but since the Second World War, and then particularly since Suez, it hasn't just been Europe's failure, it has been America's desire that they ran Western Europe. It isn't simply Europe can now decide to pivot because America has given, Trump is giving Europe the space again to be able to do that. The American pivot to the Pacific and to a different sphere of influence actually started under Barack Obama. So the signals came even before Trump that Europe will have to take responsibility for its own security. So I just think there is a balanced view. America wanted Western Europe to be its sphere of influence as much as Europe wanted America to be here.
What I also found alarming is when he says that this was signposted, and indeed it was. Trump made no secret of what he planned to do about Ukraine. He made no secret of the USA's isolationism in relation to this particular conflict. And we know that there had been positive mood music between both of those leaders in the past. But what's also been signposted, this is another one of those situations where the public has just looked on with a degree, I think, of growing concern. You say the figure of 4.5% of GDP spent by Thatcher. We've also had a discussion about our mutual friend Tony Blair and the fact that, whether you agreed or disagreed with the invasion of Iraq, this was a man that prioritised defence spending. The deprioritisation of defence spending has, in the back of the voter's mind, been deeply disturbing. Okay, because if you cannot defend your own realm, then what use are you, not just to your own people, but to the rest of the civilized, if we can call it that, Western world? And then we're suddenly meant to be surprised when the likes of China, Russia, North Korea, and others that have been arming themselves to the hilt for the last 20, 30 years, then seem to have at least Europe's nuts in a vice-like grip. I mean, that's how it feels. And so the public are looking on this going, well, what do you expect? We've now got the smallest army since the Napoleonic Wars. What is going to be the impact of that? How are others who do not have our best interests at heart going to treat us? They're going to treat us like playthings. I mean, this was as inevitable as night follows day, frankly. And now we have this new world order dictated by people who don't even have their own people's best interests at heart, but who have ploughed all of that money into their armies and their infrastructure. And we often talk, don't we, about war, particularly in the case of Ukraine, as boots on the ground. You know, the far bigger threat to us is the cyber threat and undersea cables and all the rest of it. And the British public particularly has had this sense that we have been woefully under-defended for decades.
First duty of government is the security of the nation. I think a couple of things. I think you're absolutely right that Margaret Thatcher, you knew exactly what her response would be militarily, certainly following the Falklands invasion by Argentina. Tony Blair, the 1999 famous Chicago speech, which was all about liberal interventionism, and he meant military interventionism. That, of course, all broke apart with the disastrous aftermath of the Iraq War. I wouldn't say that the Iraq War itself was the disaster. It was the lack of ability to know what to do next. And then after that, we have been, as a nation, but I think in the European Union as well, a little self-obsessed. We talk much more about funding the NHS and funding our services, and defence is never seen as a very popular subject, but it should really matter to us as a nation. And I wrote at the time of when al-Assad was toppled in Syria, Western Europe, including, of course, the UK, was nothing to do with any discussion about what next for Syria. It didn't matter what Western Europe said. That was not true in 9/11. Tony Blair was one of the most important world leaders after the attacks across America on that appalling day. We have lost, in Western Europe and particularly the UK, our leadership position. We have not focused on defence in the way that Thatcher did, in the way that Blair did. And we have to reconstitute what is Western Europe about and what are our values about and what are we going to do to defend them. The only nation that comes anywhere near where Margaret Thatcher's spending was and anywhere near Trump's target that he says that NATO members should now spend 5% of GDP on defence is Poland. That is a frontline state. The only country that really understands what it's like to be invaded and be split up
and
by
have to protect your
dictatorships.
Borders.
That's Poland. The rest of us have sat here and thought, well, we're under the umbrella of America, and that will just keep us secure into the future.
If you're living in former Soviet states right now, I'm sorry, you're really worried. I mean, at the end of the day, James Heappey was completely right there, the escalation. He was talking about step one, step two. I mean, it started with Crimea. No one really called that out. Then it went to a full-on invasion of Ukraine. If you're living in a country like Estonia, for instance, I think you're very, very deeply worried this morning about what is unfolding on your doorstep. I was just thinking about Keir Starmer in all this. I was thinking about Boris Johnson and thinking, OK, he didn't back it up with actual defence spending, and that's problematic, right? But at least he had a presence on the world stage, which was unequivocally in support of Ukraine against Putin, like no question about it, which I think was his key strength. I appreciate the man made a lot of mistakes, but I don't think he can be criticised for how he treated that issue. I actually think that the Defence Secretary, John Healey, is somebody that really gets it and is probably one of the Cabinet's brightest stars. But I get the impression that the Prime Minister might talk a good game on this reactively, but has no great appetite to be leading the Western world. I don't even think he's got the capability to do it. And then you look across the channel to Emmanuel Macron and Olaf Scholz, his besties. I mean, these people from a kind of holding up the defence end of the European Union are weak and pathetic.
The crisis in Europe that we've had of leadership because of Macron, because of Olaf Scholz, who is facing almost certain defeat in the German elections, there has been a crisis of leadership. Keir Starmer is not the person, as you say, to fill that vacuum. It's not authentic for him. Defence is not authentic for him. It's not something that he's actually interested in. Remember, we interviewed William Hague, obviously former Foreign Secretary, former leader of the Conservative Party, and he made a really interesting point about 2014 and Crimea and the Russian invasion of Crimea. He said at that stage, the rest of the European Union wouldn't go as far as David Cameron wanted to go in making it clear that there would be very heavy sanctions on Russia, and that the UK lost that argument in 2014. If we are to be in a position where Putin has shown that aggression works, and it looks like that is the case, that moment in 2014 when the EU prevaricated on the response is the moment that Putin realised he could take more of Ukraine.